The stagecoach rattled into Red Creek under a late summer sundust curling in the air like faded memories. When the door swung open, the crowd expected a fresh-faced bride in her Sunday best. Instead, a woman stepped down in torn rags. Her boots scuffed her hands, trembling her eyes carrying storms. The townsfolk stared. Some turned away. A few whispered cruel things they didn't care if she heard. Her name was Clara Boone, though most here didn't know it yet. No one asked where her fine dress was or why she looked as though she'd walked miles through heartbreak and back. No one, except Jonah Miller. A tall, weathered cowboy with a quiet gaze that saw past the dust and tatters. Without hesitation, without asking a single question, he took her hand and spoke words that silenced the street. "You'll be my wife." The onlookers were stunned. Why would a man marry a stranger in rags? What shame was Clara hiding behind those downcast eyes? The truth was, Clara hadn't come to Red Creek chasing love. She'd come running from something far darker. Jonah didn't know it yet, but her past was riding hard behind her, and it wouldn't be long before it caught up. Because on the frontier, secrets ride faster than any stagecoach. And sometimes the person you marry without knowing their story ends up changing your own. What was Clara running from, and what will Jonah do when he learns the truth? The train screeched into the station like a long sigh of iron. On the crooked platform where dry weeds leaned into the shadows of late afternoon, Clara Boone stepped down in a dress so worn it had been patched with thread that didn't even match. The wind carried the scent of rust and whispers. "Mail order bride," someone muttered near the ticket booth. "Looks like she's seen better days." Another voice snickered. There was no one to greet her, no hand raised, no name called. Only a small wooden trunk at her feet and two creased letters tucked under her sleeve. Across the platform, Jonah Pike, a widowed cattle rancher, stood like a fence post, driven deep in the earth, his hat brim pulled low. He'd come to pick up a coil of rope, not a bride. But his eyes lingered on the woman sitting straight-backed on her trunk, not crying, not pleading, just still. Jonah stepped forward, holding out his canteen. "I don't need charity," Clara said quietly. "It's not charity," Jonah replied. "Water's just water." Her voice trembled only slightly. "Do you know a man named Samuel Whitlow? He sent me the ticket, said he'd meet me here." Jonah looked down the dirt road where the last open doors were already closing. If he wanted to be here, ma'am, he'd already be here. The late sun slid across the rails like the edge of a blade. Clara adjusted the frayed collar of her dress, her shoulders unbowed. Jonah noticed the way she carried herself like someone who'd borne weight all her life and refused to stoop under it. Evening was falling fast on this wind-scoured town, and only one reckless offer could save both Clara's dignity and Jonah's silent heart. The platform emptied until it was just the two of them. Clara Boone sitting upright on her trunk and Jonah Pike leaning against a weathered post, arms folded like a man weighing the cost of a fence line. "You've got somewhere to stay?" Jonah finally asked. Clara hesitated. The letter said, "I'd have a home here." And the man who promised it, Jonah's voice was steady, but his jaw tightened. "He's not coming." Jonah's gaze moved past her, down the dusty road where a saloon door swung lazily in the heat. A woman alone in this town was an invitation for trouble, and the trouble here didn't knock first. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing the boards. "You can't sleep at the depot, ma'am. Not safe. Folks talk and talk, turns ugly." Clara's chin lifted. "Then I'll manage." Something in that answer, a refusal to crumble, struck Jonah harder than he expected. He removed his hat, running a hand through hair that the sun had bleached at the edges. "I've got a house, big enough for more than just me. No promises, no expectations. Just a roof and a lock on the door." Clara searched his face, looking for the trap in his words. Why? Because no one should be left waiting on a platform till the dark comes. She almost smiled, but the sound of her name called softly from the wind made her freeze. No one was there, only the echo of a past that had followed her west. Jonah thought offering shelter would be the end of it, but by nightfall he'd be making a vow neither of them saw coming. The ride to Jonah Pike's ranch was quiet except for the leather creak of his saddle and the soft clop of hooves on the dirt road. Clara Boone sat behind him in the wagon, her hands folded tightly in her lap, clutching a carpet bag that looked like it had weathered too many storms. Jonah had offered her the bench seat, but she'd refused, preferring the small distance. preferring to study him when he wasn't looking. The land spread out wide and open, painted gold by the lowering sun. It was the kind of view that might have made her feel free if she weren't so aware of the way her life kept turning into places she hadn't chosen. She had come west for a promise that crumbled before it began. Now she was heading toward another man's home, not as a wife or even a hired hand, but as something she didn't have a name for yet. When the ranch house came into view, Clara was startled. It was bigger than she'd imagined. Not grand like a banker's home, but solid. Wide porch, 2 chimneys, barn off to the left. It was the kind of place built for a family. She wondered if there had been one once. Jonah stopped the wagon, hopped down, and extended a hand. Clara hesitated before taking it. His grip was steady, but his eyes didn't search hers like most men's would. It was as if he was trying to show her he could hold on without holding too tight. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and something else, maybe bread, that had been baked earlier that morning. The furniture was simple but cared for. A single rocking chair sat near the hearth, a quilt folded neatly over the back. "You can take the front bedroom," Jonah said, setting her trunk just inside the door. "Locks from the inside. You'll find water in the basin and supper will be ready in a while." Clara wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small for the weight of what he was offering. Instead, she nodded and stepped into the room. It was clean. The bed was made with a patchwork quilt, and a window looked out toward the west pasture. When she came to the table later, Jonah was ladling stew into 2 bowls. He didn't talk much while they ate. She found herself grateful for that. There was a kind of comfort in silence that didn't demand she fill it. Halfway through the meal, Jonah set down his spoon. "There's something you ought to know." Clara looked up wary. "I was married once. Long time ago. She passed. And I've been keeping to myself since." He took a breath, eyes fixed on the table. "I don't take in strangers, Mrs. Boone. But when I saw you at that station—" He stopped, shook his head. "I couldn't let it happen." Clara's heart tightened. Let what happened, he met her gaze. Let another good person get ground down by this place before they've had a chance to start. She swallowed hard. "You don't know I'm a good person. I know enough." The fire popped in the hearth. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of coyotes. Something shifted inside her, then a flicker of trust, thin but real. After supper, Jonah stepped outside to tend the horses. Clara wandered to the porch, the boards cool under her feet. The sun had dropped low, bleeding red across the horizon. That's when she heard it again. Her name whispered like a warning, "Clara." She spun around, but the yard was empty. Only the tall grass moving in the breeze. Still, her pulse quickened. She knew voices didn't carry like that without someone near. Jonah returned, noticing her tension. "Something wrong?" "No," she lied. "Just taking in the view." He didn't press, but there was a question in his eyes. As the sky deepened into twilight, Jonah leaned against the porch railing. "If it makes things easier, we could put it in writing. Not just you staying here, but me making sure you're safe. Folks in town might assume things if they see you here." A paper would quiet talk. Clara stared at him, the weight of his meaning settling in. "You mean marriage? I mean keeping you from being anyone's target." Her chest tightened. She had not planned for this. She had promised herself she'd never bind her life to another man without love. But she also knew the West was no place for a woman alone. And Jonah's offer didn't carry the hunger or calculation she'd learned to expect. "Think on it," he said quietly. "No rush." But that night, lying awake in the unfamiliar bed, Clara couldn't push the thought aside. A marriage without courtship, a shelter without love, or maybe with the kind of love that grew slow like roots finding their way in dry soil. She drifted off to sleep, wondering which was more dangerous, saying yes to Jonah Pike or saying no to the only man who had offered her safety without a price. By morning, the decision would no longer be hers alone to make because the past she had been running from had already found her. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of boots crossing the porch. The light coming through the window was pale and cool. Dawn hadn't yet burned the chill from the air. She sat up slowly, aware of how her body still ached from the train ride and the days before it. Jonah was already outside, speaking in low tones to someone she couldn't see. She moved quietly to the window and peered out. A man stood near the hitching post, lean with a hat pulled low in a dust-stained coat. His horse was tied behind him, lather still clinging to its neck from a hard ride. The stranger's voice was sharp enough to carry in the morning stillness. "Heard you brought someone in from the station, Jonah. Woman in rags." That true Jonah didn't flinch. "What's it to you, Harlan?" The man Harlan spat into the dirt. "Word's been passed along. Folks are saying she's trouble, that she owes money. Maybe more than money." Clara's fingers tightened around the curtain. She knew this moment would come sooner or later. Trouble had a way of traveling faster than the truth. Jonah's reply was steady. "She's my guest. That's all anyone needs to know." But Harlan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You can't protect everyone, Jonah. You try, you'll end up like last time." Jonah's jaw tensed. Without another word, he turned his back on Harlan and came inside. When he saw Clara standing by the window, he didn't look surprised. "You heard yes," she admitted. "And it's true, I left debts behind. Not mine, but my late husband's. They'll come for it if they think I'm worth the trouble." Jonah poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one in front of her. "Then they'll have to come through me." She wanted to tell him not to bother, that she'd been protecting herself for years one way or another. But the words died in her throat when she saw the quiet conviction in his face. This wasn't the swagger of a man making empty promises. This was something deeper. The day passed in a kind of uneasy calm. Clara helped with the washing, mended a torn shirt, and even fed the hens. But every time she stepped outside, her eyes searched the horizon. She kept thinking she saw figures in the distance, though it might have only been heat shimmer. By late afternoon, Jonah returned from the north pasture with a small burlap sack. "Got some seed to plant," he said. "If you're willing, I could use the company." Clara followed him out, the earth warm under her boots. As they worked side by side, she found herself telling him about the years before, how she'd been married off young to a man who saw her as little more than an extra set of hands. How she'd been told her worth was in the meals she cooked, the shirts she mended, and the silence she kept. "I stayed because I thought that's what a good wife did," she said quietly, pushing seed into the soil. "But when he died, I learned how quickly people can decide you're nothing without a man beside you." Jonah didn't speak for a long while. Then he said, "Maybe you're planting in the wrong ground. Folks like that will never see what you're worth." She looked at him, surprised at the gentleness in his voice. "And you do." His eyes held hers, steady and sure. "I see enough to know you've been standing on your own for a long time. But maybe it's time you had someone to stand with you." The warmth of his words settled into her bones, but before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats broke the moment. 3 riders appeared over the rise, moving fast. Clara's breath caught. Even at a distance, she recognized the lead rider, the man who had tried to collect her late husband's debts before she fled. His name was Briggs, and he had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Jonah stepped forward, his hand resting near the butt of his revolver. "Stay behind me," he murmured. Briggs reined in, hard dust swirling around the horses. "Well, if it ain't Clara Boone," he drawled. "Didn't think I'd find you so quick. And look at you settled in already. Almost like you belong here." Clara's heart pounded. "I told you before I don't have what you're after." Briggs grinned. "See, that's the thing. I'm not here for money anymore. I'm here for you." Jonah's voice was like steel. "You've got no claim." Briggs's grin widened. "Claim or not, the law won't help her. But maybe we can work out a trade man to man." The air was thick with dust and danger. Clara could feel the weight of every choice she'd made pressing in on her. Jonah hadn't asked for this yet. Here he stood ready to face down men who wouldn't think twice about breaking him. And in that moment, she understood something. This wasn't just about debts or danger anymore. This was about whether she was willing to let someone fight for her, or whether she'd keep running until there was nowhere left to go. By sundown, someone would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and Clara would have to choose whose side she was truly on. The wind had dropped, leaving the yard heavy with silence. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, stamping restlessly, but not making a sound. Jonah stood between Clara and the 3 riders, his shadow stretching long in the late-day sun. His right hand rested near his revolver, not in a threat, but in readiness. Briggs shifted in the saddle, eyes cold. "You're a smart man, Jonah. Don't waste your time on someone else's baggage. Let her go, and I'll ride out of here without trouble." Jonah's voice was quiet but firm. "You've already brought trouble." Clara could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. She had been in moments like this before, men speaking about her as if she wasn't standing right there. But this time was different. This time there was someone who was refusing to hand her over. Briggs swung one leg over and dropped to the ground, his boots crunching in the dry earth. He took a slow step forward. You know, I've seen men ruin themselves over women who ain't worth half the fight they bring. Jonah's eyes didn't leave him. Maybe you've never known a woman worth the fight. Clara's throat tightened. She had heard many men claim to care for her in her lifetime, but never like this, not with words that felt anchored, unshaken. Briggs laughed low and mean. She's got nothing, Jonah. No land, no name worth remembering. She's a burden you'll regret. Clara stepped forward before she could stop herself. Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. He doesn't owe you an explanation, and neither do I. You've got your answer now, Ride. The other two men shifted in their saddles, waiting for Briggs's signal. Jonah's stance didn't change, but his voice hardened. You heard the lady. For a moment, Clara thought Briggs might draw his gun, but instead he spat into the dirt, turned on his heel, and swung back into the saddle. You're making a mistake, he said, more to Jonah than to her. Men like me? We don't forget. He yanked the reins and the riders wheeled around, kicking up a storm of dust as they disappeared over the ridge. When the sound of hoofbeats finally faded, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her knees felt weak, and she gripped the fence post to steady herself. Jonah turned to her, eyes searching. You all right? I will be, she said. But even as she spoke, the weight of what had just happened sank in. Jonah had risked himself for her without hesitation, and she knew what that meant in a place like this. Reputation was as valuable as gold, and enemies were costly to make. Why, she asked, the word escaping before she could stop it. Why would you stand in front of me like that? Jonah's gaze softened. Because you're under my roof, and because no one deserves to be treated like a piece of property. Her chest ached, not from fear, but from the quiet truth in his words. She had lived so long believing she was only ever someone's possession, her worth tied to what she could do for them. Jonah's way of seeing her felt like standing in sunlight after years in the cold. That evening, Clara tried to busy herself with supper, but her hands kept pausing over the work. She could hear Jonah outside tending the animals, his voice low as he spoke to the horses. When he finally came in, the light from the oil lamp caught the weariness on his face. Yet he smiled at her as if the day hadn't taken anything from him. They ate quietly, the simple comfort of food filling the space between them. And somewhere between the passing of the bread and the pouring of coffee, Clara realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about where she would run next. Later, she found herself standing at the open doorway, looking out into the dark. The stars stretched endlessly, their light soft over the hills. She thought of Briggs' words, of the years she had spent being measured and found wanting, and of Jonah's steady presence in the face of it all. Jonah came to stand beside her. It's going to get harder before it gets easier, he said quietly. Men like him, they don't walk away for good. Clara nodded. I know, but I'm tired of running. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but something that steadied her. Then you won't have to. And in that simple exchange, something shifted, subtle but undeniable. By morning, Clara would face a choice: keep holding herself apart for safety's sake, or take the first step toward belonging somewhere and to someone for good. The sun rose pale and hazy, casting a muted glow over the valley. Clara woke before Jonah, drawn from sleep by a restless hum inside her chest. She sat at the small table in the kitchen, fingers curled around a chipped mug of coffee, staring out at the barn, where Jonah's horses stood silhouetted in the morning mist. Her peace didn't last. The sound of hoofbeats drifted in from the ridge, slow, deliberate, and wrong. These weren't the easy, work-worn steps of a rancher heading to town. They were the measured approach of men who wanted to be heard before they were seen. Jonah appeared in the doorway, shirt half-buttoned, eyes already sharp. Stay inside, he said. 3 riders crested the hill. Clara recognized Briggs immediately, his frame rigid in the saddle, his face set like carved stone. The other 2 were different this time. Bigger men, heavier in the shoulders, their eyes scanning the place like they were already dividing it into spoils. Jonah stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching in the dry dirt. You're back sooner than I figured, he said evenly. Briggs smirked. Told you I don't forget. You've got something of mine. She's not yours, Jonah said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried in the stillness, like the first crack of thunder. Clara gripped the edge of the table inside every muscle taut. Part of her wanted to run out the back into the hills anywhere they couldn't follow. That was the habit life had carved into her. Survive first, breathe later. But she didn't move. Instead, she stepped to the doorway. "If you came here for me," she said, her voice cutting across the yard, "you're wasting your time." Briggs's gaze snapped to her. "You think this man will keep you safe? He's just a rancher. I've got friends in every saloon from here to Santa Fe." Jonah took a slow step forward, placing himself between them. "You're on my land, Briggs. I'll give you the chance to turn your horse around and ride out." The tension wound tighter like a rope pulled to breaking. Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. And then, without warning, one of Briggs' men nudged his horse forward, spitting into the dust. "Maybe we take the whole place, then see how long she stands by you." That did it. Clara stepped down off the porch, her boots sinking into the soft dirt. Her voice was clear, almost calm. "I've spent my life letting men decide what I'm worth. That ends today." For a moment, even Briggs was silent. Jonah looked at her, his jaw tightening, not in anger, but in something like pride. "You want to take me," Clara continued. "You'll have to walk past him and past me, knowing you'll never break either of us." The big man in the saddle shifted, uncertainty flashing across his face. Briggs' smirk faltered. The moment stretched brittle as dry pine. Finally, Briggs leaned back in his saddle. "You're not worth the trouble," he muttered, though his eyes told another story. He jerked the reins and the three of them turned riding off in a cloud of dust. When the yard was quiet again, Clara's knees felt weak, but she stood straight. Jonah stepped to her side, his voice low. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," she said, meeting his gaze. "I did." They stood there a long moment, the wind tugging at Clara's hair, the silence settling like a warm blanket instead of a cold shroud. Inside, the coffee had gone cold, but something else had warmed, a flicker of belonging, small but steady burning, in the space between them. That night, Jonah lit the fire earlier than usual. The two of them sat close, the glow casting soft shadows across the room. He didn't say much, and neither did she. But when he reached over and covered her hand with his, Clara didn't pull away. She realized then that the fear which had followed her for years was still there, but it no longer owned her. She had faced it in the open daylight and chosen to stay. By dawn, a decision would rise: would the sun remain a guest under Jonah's roof, or accept the unspoken invitation to make it her home? Spring came early that year. Snowmelt rushed down from the mountains, feeding the creek until it sang against the stones. The air held that first warm breath after months of cold, and with it came a strange, tentative peace. Clara woke to the sound of laughter light unguarded. She followed it to the barn and found Jonah tossing a small burlap sack toward one of the ranch hands, teasing him about missing the catch. It was the first time she'd seen him smile without restraint, and for a moment she just stood there leaning against the doorway, letting the sight settle into her. When Jonah noticed her, his expression softened in that way that made her feel seen, not for what she'd endured or what she'd done to survive, but for the woman she was right now. Later that morning, they shared breakfast at the table: simple eggs, bread, still warm from the oven, and coffee that smelled stronger than it tasted. Conversation flowed easily, without the careful pauses they used to leave between sentences. Jonah leaned back in his chair. "I've been thinking," he began, "about fixing up the old north pasture. It'd be good for running more cattle." Clara smiled. "That sounds like a big job." "It is," he agreed, his eyes holding hers. "Which is why I can't do it alone." She realized then he wasn't just talking about the pasture. In the days that followed, Jonah began including her in decisions, not as a courtesy, but as if her voice mattered as much as his. They rode out together to mend fence lines, and when the work was done, they lingered on the ridge, watching the valley stretch wide and endless below. One evening after they'd returned from town, Jonah stopped her on the porch. The sky behind him was lit in a wash of oranges and rose gold, the kind of sunset that feels like it might never come again. "I don't care about the past you don't want to speak of," he said. "I care about what's ahead, and I'd like it if you were there with me." Clara's breath caught. No man had ever asked her to stay without conditions, without shaping her into something else first. Weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of the ranch became their shared heartbeat. The scars on Clara's spirit hadn't vanished, but they no longer dictated the shape of her days. She found herself humming while she worked, sleeping without waking to listen for danger, and most surprising of all, laughing without bracing for what might follow. One quiet afternoon, she walked past the mirror in their room and caught her reflection. The woman looking back was older, yes, but her eyes were brighter. She carried herself differently, as if the weight on her shoulders had lightened without her noticing. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Jonah handed her a small carved wooden box. Inside lay a simple silver ring. "I don't need an answer tonight," he said softly. "I just want you to know this isn't about saving you. It's about loving you, exactly as you are." Clara felt her throat tighten. For years, she had measured herself by the way others had treated her, discarded, traded, diminished. But here in the quiet of this room, she understood something she'd never dared believe: she was enough. She closed the box and set it gently on the table. Then she reached for Jonah's hand. "Let's see what tomorrow brings," she said. The next morning, the sun spilled through the curtains, and Clara stepped outside to find Jonah already in the yard, waving her over. He handed her a cup of coffee, warm and steady in her palms. They stood there side by side, watching the day begin, not as rescuer, and rescued, not as strangers, bound by circumstance, but as two people who had chosen each other. And for the first time in her life, Clara didn't feel like she was waiting for her place in the world. She was already standing in it. She had arrived in rags, burdened by a past that threatened to silence her. She stayed because someone finally heard her without her having to explain a thing. But what happens when the woman who was once lost finds not only her home, but her voice? In the quiet after the storm, Clara stood on the porch of the Miller Ranch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. She no longer wore rags, but more importantly, she no longer wore fear. Jonah's hand rested in hers, solid, warm, and certain. What had begun as a desperate act between strangers had grown into something steady, rooted like the cottonwoods along the creek. Clara had learned that love doesn't always arrive with fanfare. It can slip in quietly, choosing you for who you are not, for what you've lost, or how you appear. And Jonah, he found that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is open his door to a soul in need without needing to know all the answers first. Friend, maybe you've carried your own rags through life, hurts, losses, moments you thought defined you forever. But just as Clara discovered, there's still room for love, kindness, and second chances. Out here in the West, or wherever you are, hearts can heal no matter how long they've been hurting. If this story touched you, I invite you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, for more tales of redemption, late-blooming love, and the quiet courage of everyday folks. Share it with someone who needs a little hope today. And tell me in the comments, would you like to see more of Clara and Jonah's journey, or hear another story of love finding its way home?